Welcome to the CHDS Master's Thesis Series. I'm Heather Isbron, and with me today are Nick Knowlton. Nick is an adjudications officer with the U.S. Citizen and Immigration Services, and Bob O'Malley, attorney advisor for the General Counsel at the Department of Homeland Security. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hi, Heather.
Heather, how's it going?
So you two are in the same class, almost graduating, and you both wrote theses on immigration. And the reason why we're doing this interview today is because you have such great recommendations for the new administration. Talk about how you came about your subject. Nick, you go first.
Speaking personally, I've always been fascinated by the subject of immigration, insofar as it's a very broad subject and it speaks to a lot of different areas, speaking to society as well as Homeland Security. It speaks to labor, it speaks to civil society, speaks to how we practice democracy in the United States, and it speaks to how we welcome new citizens into our own communities, how we build resilient communities in times of distress, in times of crisis. So for me, I was personally intrigued by, one, trying to better understand this subject for my own personal and professional purposes, but more so, trying to identify ways that integration may be built upon or improved, either through policy or through local level initiatives.
How about you, Bob?
Yeah, so I've spent a large part of my professional life at the U.S.-Mexico border and overseas, adjudicating different types of applications for people that wanted to immigrate to the United States. And I'd come home from work and I'd turn on the TV and I'd see a debate happening about immigration. And I wanted to make sure that people understood what was happening, not only at the border, but once people were admitted into the United States. You know, there are people coming every day from all walks of life to the US, but there wasn't a whole lot of answers about what do we do with them once they're here? And how do we take care of the people that are allowed into the US? So one thing led to another and the research began.
And so the common thread for both theses seems to be about integration.
Yeah.
So talk to me about that.
So to keep it simple, integration is what happens once you're in the United States, right? What do you do once you're admitted here? What's your next step? Who do you talk to? What are you going to do? How do you line up a job or school for your kids? And what the interplay is between the federal government, the local government, and the individuals, right? Who is responsible for what, when, and what is the best way to move forward, like Nick said, in building a resilient community that's full of immigrants.
And Nick?
I mean, to build on that point, so integration is both fascinating and frustrating because there is no one universally accepted definition of what integration is. For our purposes, Bob and I seem to revolve around a more common sense, narrow interpretation of integration. We're looking at it insofar as building people into their communities such that, in contradistinction to prior initiatives, namely assimilation, that emphasized the shedding of one's identity once they came to the United States. We're talking perhaps in the 1900s or 19th century in the early 1900s. We're looking at integration as using one's own identity, leveraging one's own identity when they come to the United States to build upon those traditions and experiences and culture to make the whole of the community greater than the sum of its own parts. So for us, I'm looking at integration in terms of opportunities for new citizens, primarily where opportunities are less dictated by one's race or ethnicity than by their own qualifications. And I think that's something that both Bob and I agree with in both of our projects.
If you want to build back better and you want to strengthen the integration system and be more inclusive, then you have to have a good plan for how to include people. And that plan either didn't exist or wasn't working. So our projects kind of answer that question. We build the plan or the roadmap to make the U.S. more inclusive.
So you're saying it was broke or unknown in terms of strategy and policy. And so how did you identify the gaps?
My project was a comparative analysis, right? I took different US localities, countries overseas, and I studied what their plans were, right? Look at the numbers, look at the policies and the procedures, and see what works and what didn't work. And once you start comparing different areas, using a rubric that we created from a few different international agencies and kind of splicing it all together and creating a grading system of sorts, we were able to find weaknesses and strengths in each one of the cases and analyze each case to come up with recommendations and findings to really just cherry pick what worked in each one of them and then apply them to a very complex body of laws in the United States.
And so that's where it gets weird, right? Because it's very complex and people give up because it's hard to do.
Right.
So give me an example of what that looks like with some flesh and blood on it.
So whereas Bob was looking more at a comparative analysis of US policy with other countries or even within the United States with different localities, I was investigating a particular area of integration as it concerned electoral participation, that is voting. Prior literature or prior research indicates that there's an intuitive relationship between voting and integration, and that makes sense. But what we don't know exactly is the why and the how behind this relationship. That's what I sought to investigate, and that's what I sought to explain in my project. And in doing so, I came across prior research indicating that participation in elections appeared or was correlated with increases in democraticness or civil society in different countries. I was curious as to whether or not a certain similar effect could occur within democracies themselves. That is, if there are new citizens coming to the United States, can electoral participation, can voting facilitate the integration process by means of socializing new citizens, not just to democratic norms, but particularly democratic norms and civic activity, the way that it's practiced in the United States. And in addition, we can look at integration through the recruitment process. Traditionally speaking, and this is, excuse me for applying a very folksy type of party recruitment process, but in the broad literature, right, we regard political parties as seeking to recruit as many people as possible into their coalitions. In this case, when it comes to integration, we see parties seeking to recruit both established citizens and new citizens. In this case, elections and particularly electoral campaigns are unique opportunities for new citizens and the parties to learn about each other's interests, learn about each other's values, find or identify where commonalities exist, and seek accommodation where interests align, or alternatively, seek alternatives either through other parties or through other coalitions. In this case, we see that integration can occur both ways, not just with new citizens integrating towards the American mainstream, if you want to define it that way, but also political parties and the communities that they represent integrating towards new citizens by building them within their coalitions and accommodating to their particular interests, particularly when those interests are congruent to a larger body of voters.
Yeah. So what examples that I think of are some of the cities along the Rust Belt in the United States, specifically Dayton, Ohio, was one of my case studies. And Dayton, Ohio was a city that was largely economically built on manufacturing and had taken a downturn. And the individuals in the board of Dayton recognized this and sought to bolster their economy, but also change the way their civic society worked by engaging with immigrants. And it was the whole of government approach for the city of Dayton. It took the highest level of commissioners to the police commissioner to artists on the street, right? Everyone kind of got together, got engaged in a community setting, and started developing plans, right? They started communicating with each other, as well as different groups, as well as the government. And they literally sat in a hall and hashed out their plan for their city. And you could see throughout the years, their economic growth started, They were able to recover from the hole they had gotten themselves in economically. The relationship between the immigrants and the police started to increase in that there was more reporting of crime by immigrant communities. And people literally took surveys every year that said they felt more welcome. And it's those types of theories that we want to replicate and expound on. And it's not just in the United States, it's overseas. They're to build a curriculum that shows people where they can go for things and who they can trust and who they can talk to. The government is in a great position where they can make a first impression on someone that's going to be living in their community. And it works both ways. It's a relationship that needs to be a give and take. And once that's down to a science, there's nothing more effective.
So there's a federal piece and also your local piece, the state and local piece. So what are some of the federal takeaways here? What are some of the recommendations that can be implemented into federal policy for this, for your recommendations?
Sure. The first one is that, the federal government's often or almost always the one that makes the determination as to whether or not someone is allowed to stay in the United States, with a goal of creating more naturalized citizens, right? So there's a lot of different processes and places for an immigrant to go through the process with the goal of being naturalization. We'd like to add to that process, while not complicating it, but arguably simplifying it, a curriculum that is an integration-based curriculum that kind of fills in all the gaps, and also streamlines the immigration process. So if you have a more informed immigrant community, they're able to more effectively immigrate, right? So then they can go through the naturalization process more quickly. There's less issues, there's less red tape, less bureaucracy, and you have a more informed population. And I think that is the biggest takeaway for the federal level that I can think of.
So what would complicate that? Why aren't we doing that? What are the issues with that particular approach?
I think there are probably a lot of different issues, right? And to start over from scratch a very complicated process that has a lot of different loopholes or pitfalls, right? When you have a legal system like the United States does, it's oftentimes every time a policy tries to go into place, it has to go through the courts, right? Whether it comes from the executive branch or the legislature, there's a cascading effect, right? And so oftentimes they end up in a courtroom. But different agencies like USCIS, like CBP, the Customs and Border Protection, or even Customs Enforcement and Immigration Customs Enforcement, or ICE, they all have a role to play. And it's really just supplementing their roles, right? If ICE or Customs and Border Protection can provide more thorough know your rights videos to individuals while they're going through the process, right? That could help inform people, right? And there are alternative to detention programs. If those programs were a bit more robust and the communication between our federal partners and our local partners was a bit better, it would lead to a more informed population. And that's the whole point here. As long as we keep engaged with stakeholders, we continue to grow and continue to inform each other. I also think the takeaway, another really important takeaway, is to engage stakeholders that may not be government. There are all types of non-governmental organizations that are trying to help, right? That are applying for grants or have a fee structure in place so that they can really get down on the ground level with these people and assist them to a better life. And we need to do a better job at working with those partners.
Nick, what do you have to add to that?
That's a great point. I do want to add to Bob's conversation with respect that historically speaking, the United States has taken a rather hands-off approach to integration by means of leveraging the tools from NGOs to provide integration curriculum, by leveraging immigrants seeking their own initiatives to integrate themselves into their local communities, by building on new immigrants' networks and families as resources for integration. Now, historically speaking, that's worked out rather well. We know comparatively that's worked out rather well, just having a hands-off approach. But what we're looking for in our projects are what areas can be improved, notwithstanding this historically hands-off hands-off approach. And in my case, for example, I'm looking at modest improvements or modest revisions, such as incorporating voter education as part of the naturalization process. What this looks like in practice is perhaps including information about where integrating citizens can go to register, what information is required to register, where their local voting precinct is located, and what happens after they turn out to vote. This may also include, in a pandemic situation, information about voting absentee, or also known as voting by mail. These are just some preliminary initiatives. They don't require a lot of, they might not necessarily require a lot of effort on the part of policymakers, but these are small, modest changes that can still provide a rather robust improvement in your overall system, providing new opportunities for integrating citizens.
So what I'm hearing you say and recommend is at the federal level to integrate this curriculum, which includes voting, and giving them a reason and an understanding of how that's going to help them and their communities become more educated, and just implementing that into the naturalization process at the highest level so that it's actually done. Because, I'm just thinking about it as, when I get here from another country, I want to make sure that I can feed my family and be safe. And I don't really care about elections, but I should, and you have to give me a reason to, right? So making that part of the test or part of the education process, is that what you're saying?
That's a good point. So I think you raise an interesting point in terms of what's in it for the new citizen, for the integrating citizen. Well, we know that the data shows a positive correlation between rates of voting and turnout and other metrics related to integration by means of family income, education, and employability, for that matter. That is, that people that are turning out to vote, particularly new citizens that are turning out to vote, they are making more money than their non-voting counterparts. They tend to have higher education than their non-voting counterparts, as well as other metrics. This is, the data from US Census shows a positive correlation between these two factors. My research even showed a case study of a prominent immigrant community in the United States that did lend credibility to the hypothesis that political activation of the community led to further integration among various metrics, such that it was reasonable to argue that without this political activation, without the increased turnout of this community, that they would likely not have had as successful a rise in integration metrics without this input.
So that would make me pay attention. If I feel like I'm going to make more money and be more employable, and if I feel safe in my community, then maybe I'll be more inclined to vote. So I just think that that's really the key here, is making sure that we get it at a high enough level so that people can, understand when they first get here. But that's not going to be their first concern. So weaving that into their narrative would be helpful. Bob, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. I've seen buses and buses and buses of people come from the border and be dropped off at a Greyhound station, and that's it, right? And they're on their own. And it used to happen every day. And every day I would wonder, well, how far are they going to get, right? Where's the next meal going to come from, literally? Mm-hmm. And I think the only way you ever solve that issue is through communication. And it's through communication at the local level with federal support, right? So the bus pulls up and it drops the folks off, but it doesn't drop the folks off to an empty Greyhound station. It drops them off to an NGO that is willing to usher them through the station, make sure they're on the right route, right? And then there's someone on the receiving end, whether that's a private partner or someone from the local government. I mean, could you imagine if the bus arrived in Monterey's bus station and someone from the mayor's council was waiting for them to explain where they can go to get temporary care, or where they could go to meet people that are like them, right? And the next day or a week later, someone else checks in and says, hey, have you eaten? Have you had somewhere to sleep? Do you know where you're going to be for the next month? And then all of a sudden now I've built a network, and it's been 6 months and I'm starting to learn things. And that's how you build the resilient community.
Mhm. And just for the edification of our audience, having that communication with the community as well, and that buy-in is probably just as important, so that there can be more help in just supporting the NGOs and an understanding and a welcoming community and making it in their best interest. So talk to me about why resilience in communities can be strengthened with this approach.
Yeah, so there's no doubt that community engagement at the person-to-person level is extremely important. It's crucial to the success. And there's a great case example in Dayton, Ohio. There were literally groups of musicians that came from around the world that came together and played a concert for each other, right? And it was through that concert that they were able to exchange messages, right? They were able to literally build a band from different parts of the world. And it was that understanding, right? They had something in common. They loved the music, and they were able to create that music. And it wasn't just music for their specific community, but rather for all of Dayton, right? It was inclusive of the people that have been there for 200 years, as much as it was for the people that got there last week. And once everyone started speaking the same language, literally and figuratively, through this music, it took off like wildfire. The community started to gather. These events started to get bigger. They started to branch out. Now you have a house or an event that you can house all of those different NGOs, right? And it's made from people in the community. It didn't require any mandatory learning curve, or it didn't require any incentive. It was, come if you want to be part of this message. Come if you have something to share. And it created a snowball effect. And it allowed local level leaders and federal partners to engage with the community.
And so you have messages in your thesis recommendations for the federal folks and implementing new strategies and policies, a curriculum. And then at the local and state level, those recommendations as well. So who else is your audience for your theses?
I think this thesis could be literally read by anyone, right? It could be read by the individual who's living in that neighborhood, all the way up to any council at the federal level, and everyone in between, right? Everyone has something to learn from these issues, because everyone is affected by them, right? You're either an immigrant yourself, you have loved ones that are immigrants, you have neighbors that are immigrants. The United States is supposed to be a nation of immigrants. That hasn't changed. We just are starting to act like it, right? And it's when we start putting these types of plans into place, those are the actions, right? These are the actions that help us build and rebuild that nation of immigrants. So you could look to your left, you could look to your right, and you see an immigrant, right? So anybody can read it, anybody can learn from it, anyone can use it. And that was, I don't know about Nick, but that was my proudest moment when I was creating this, is that it really can go to anybody.
How about you, Nick?
That's a great question, Heather. I think on my end, there are a few audiences that I have in mind with my thesis. First, this can include those within and outside of academia that are just looking to learn more about what integration is, and how it's been applied and how it's been characterized, both within the fields of sociology and within the fields of political science. So audience number one are those that are just looking to learn more about this subject. The thesis was written in a digestible format for a wide audience, to provide a wide survey of the field and to map out where those differences lie. On another level, however, I'm also interested in speaking to an audience looking to understand more about integration as it applies in other ways. I mentioned before that there is this intuitive relationship between voting and integration, but we don't know why and we don't know how. So audience number two, right, is available to learn more about this particular process. But then furthermore, right, we have implications and discussion that's policy relevant and practical that can be applied in an outside setting. So whether we're speaking to policymakers looking for ways to improve upon integration policy, or even those within the NGO sector that are looking for ways to improve what their organizations are doing. I think this thesis speaks to those issues, and I think that at least it would be my hope, or I'd anticipate, that they may take something tangible away from this project.
Excellent. And we have a history here at the center of people who've written theses like yourself who have recommendations that are implemented, and then some student in the future carries those through to fruition. So there's lots of building upon thesis recommendations as well. But I think that, just from an outsider's view, just making it understood to the audiences how they can benefit from implementing your recommendations will give them the buy-in they need to move and to actually do the work. Because, people don't just naturally wake up one day and say, look, I want to make the world a better place. I'm going to do integration better. We got to make sure we identify those exact audiences and communities and the feds to make sure that we get these theses in the right hands. And so I'm just so excited for the work that you've been doing on this particular topic. Is there anything that we missed, anything you want to say to the folks that would be trying to implement your recommendations?
I might just add that, I concede that integration is a complex subject. If there's one thing that Bob and I have tried to do with our projects, is to simplify where we can, to streamline this topic for a wide audience, to better understand this process, how it applies in theory, and as well as how it applies in practice. And so, the takeaway that I get from this is, integration doesn't just end at when somebody becomes a naturalized citizen. It's actually just the beginning, but more so, integration cuts both ways. On the one hand, we understand that that someone who seeks to be part of the United States will go through their own integration journey, but at the same time, right, there are communities that they integrate into. They're also learning, they're also adjusting, and they're also becoming something different than what they were before. And so, in this case, as I mentioned before in my thesis, integration cuts both ways, both with those that are integrating and the communities that welcome them into their respective neighborhoods, cities, and states. Bob, did you have anything you want to add on your end?
No, I think that's right? It's a multilateral agreement. Everyone needs to be on the same page or close to it, right? And that's no easy task when you're talking about non-governmental and governmental actors all the way up and down, all the way down to the individual level, right? But we're not asking to revamp the immigration system, right? We're asking to help include immigrants more into the fabric of the United States while maintaining a strong, structured, and safe legal immigration system. There's nothing in these theses that's radical, right? It's taking what we already have, building upon it to make it more efficient and more in line with the policy goals that are in place for today. And I think we've done a pretty good job of doing that, and I'm pretty proud of the work.
If I can add one last thing, I do want to note that why does integration matter? What our research has shown, you spoke before about resilient communities, but there's more than just building resilient communities. Successful integration policy, provides opportunities for new citizens to advance themselves socioeconomically. That is, to get better jobs, to get more money for their children. That benefits everyone. Also, right, successful integration policy provides democratic dividends. If people are practicing democracy as practiced in the United States, if they're engaging in their civic duties, that provides dividend benefits in a whole host of other areas. So for that reason, we do hope that people will read our research, enjoy it, and perhaps use it either for their own academic ends or perhaps for their own interests in improving immigration policy in the United States.
And I just think that this is a perfect time for you to release your theses as we look at immigration again. And just through attrition, I think we're able to be a more diverse nation. And the whole idea of opportunity is what makes America great. So I just feel that this, and through your research, I think you have demonstrated that it can be a benefit. And we just have to change our perspective a little bit from being exclusive to being more inclusive. And I just appreciate the work you two have done on this. And we will make your theses available in our digital library, and as well as some supplemental information for those who are viewing. And they can, of course, contact you if they have any questions, right?
Please contact us. We're happy to talk.
Excellent. Thank you two for being with us today, and good luck in getting this into the hands of the people that can actually make the change, our citizens and our legislators.